Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on psychosocial impact assessment, practical ways to identify impacts during SIA and HIA. Today's webinar is being hosted in part by the International Association for Impact Assessment, or IAIA. IAIA is the leading global network on using best practices in impact assessment for making better and more informed decisions. My name is Keisha Blaser. I work with IAIA, and I will be hosting today's webinar, but mostly behind the scenes. You'll mostly be hearing from our webinar presenter and panelists, who you'll meet in just a moment. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a couple different things. First, if there's anything that you hear during today's webinar that you would like to share on LinkedIn or other social medias, please feel free to do so. You can see our Twitter or X handle there at IAIA Network, as well as a hashtag you can use if you're going to share any important tidbits that you learned today. Next up, I would also like to point you to our website, www.iaia.org, where you can find a variety of different resources relating to impact assessment. So first, all of our webinars that we offer are recorded and available on demand on our website. Only a couple are there on the screen for you to see, considering environmental and social impacts related to green hydrogen, and the first part of today's webinar, the first installment of it, I should say, that was on psychosocial impact assessment that we did back in November of 2024. So those are just two of the webinars we have, but we also have a variety on health, biodiversity, and social impact assessment, and many more, so please do go check those out. Next, I'd like to point your attention to some of our upcoming events. Namely, we have IAIA 25, our annual conference happening this year in Bologna, Italy, the 1st through 4th of May. Registration is still open for a few more weeks, but does close soon on the 10th of April. So if you are interested in attending that, there are also some training courses that are happening ahead of time, as well as tech visits happening afterward. Please go to our website and find more information to get registered soon. Additionally, we have a couple of different online training courses that are available right now. So there's one in leadership in environmental and social impact assessment happening in early April, as well as a course on conflict management and resolution in EIA projects happening in mid-April. Registration is open for both those courses now, and more information can be found on our website. Next up, we also have training available through our professional development program, of which we have two different courses. First, we have a Foundations of Impact Assessment course that's more relating to the environmental impact assessment focus. And we also have a course entirely focused on social impact assessment. Registration is open for both courses, which run from the 2nd of June through the 25th of August. And then finally, on our website, you can also find a variety of free downloadable publications like our best practice principles, IA fast tips, and more. So again, all of that is at www.iaia.org. Next up, a few pieces of housekeeping before we get started. So first off, yes, today's webinar will be recorded. If you are attending here live right now, it will still be recorded and sent to you within a couple days of the live broadcast. Otherwise, those can also be found at our website. Next up, to point your attention to some of the control panels. If you have joined us for webinar before, you'll notice that it looks a little bit different than in the past. So I've pointed out a few different controls that might be helpful for you. First up, there's the chat box. There's a questions tab. So we will end today's webinar with a Q&A with the panelists and presenters. But at any point during the webinar, you can put in a question on the questions tab by typing it in there, and we'll flag that for the Q&A. Next up, the slides for today are available, as well as a fast tip on psychosocial impact assessment, and those can be found on the Materials tab of the control panel. And then finally, if you're having trouble hearing or seeing anybody's webcam or microphone, you might want to check the Settings tab and see if something looks off there. Now we're going to get started. So I will hand it over to today's webinar facilitator, Will Rifkin. Will is a sociologist and applied regional economist affiliated with the University of Newcastle. He has been developing new methods and insights for fostering more widespread understanding of social and economic impacts and for guiding local and regional change. Applications have addressed community impacts of development of onshore natural gas resources, development of waste-to-energy facilities, growing the circular economy outside urban centers, and the approaching closure of coal mines and power stations in rural Australia. So with that, Will, over to you.
Thank you. Welcome to everyone this morning. Could we flick on to the next slide and the next slide after that? So Today's topic is psychosocial impact assessment. As you well know, at the last webinar we offered late last year, the feedback suggested that people wanted practical ways to identify impacts during social impact assessment and health impact assessment. So this webinar focuses on those practical insights. What do people say that indicate psychosocial impacts? How do you relay those messages so that they're convincing to your clients, government, and industry? We're going to begin with a couple of slides on your interest in the topic. We asked you when you registered, why are you attending this webinar? And what are the kinds of challenges that you would like to tackle? Then my colleague Sergio Moreira will give an introduction to our psychosocial impact assessment working group, which has been meeting online for 5 years or so, and give a brief overview of what is psychosocial impact assessment. That'll be followed by a vignette presented by Mike Edelstein about family disintegration in the face of exposure to chemicals leaking from a factory, which will be accompanied by a panel discussion probing, Mike, how did you get that data? What else did you see in the community? How did you report it? What were the outcomes? A second vignette follows where Sergio discusses an open pit mining project and community responses to that, followed by another panel discussion, and then we get to the question and answers segment. Next slide, please. So what you indicated to us was you're facing issues related to resettlement, wildfire, chemical contamination, industrial disasters, nuclear, hydropower, climate change, development projects, crime, and conflict. You're concerned about existing injustices, such as effects of colonialization that still have an impact on First Nations groups, forced labor, child marriage, gender-based violence, poverty, historical trauma, effects on children, political events, stigma in admitting mental health impacts. And you have questions about variations in psychosocial impacts, the developed world versus the developing world, and one site versus other sites. Next slide, please. The strategies you'd like to learn are how, as a proponent or an employer or a community, can you anticipate and mitigate psychosocial impact? How do you get vulnerable, as an impact assessor, how do you get vulnerable people to open up and trust you as the impact assessor? And how do you best use mental health professionals in assessing psychosocial impact? How does this analysis fit with traditional knowledge, traditional medicine, and spirituality? How do you integrate psychosocial impact assessment with more general impact assessment, health impact assessment, social impact assessment? And how can we develop a shared language, tools, and frameworks and identify best practice models, guidance, and regulation? Okay, next slide, please. So now I'll hand over to my colleague, Sergio Moreira, who will begin with a brief introduction of himself, and then he'll introduce the working group. Over to you, Sergio.
Hey, thank you, Will. Part of the role that you are. It's great to be back here to have this second seminar on psychosocial impact assessment. So, if one thing positive came out of COVID was meeting a group of people within this working group, and to start this joint venture of exploring what is psychosocial impacts, what is psychosocial impact assessments, and with the objective of kind of getting further in our understanding, but also raising awareness of the people that are around us. So just so you know, this is an open group. We are always looking for new voices. So if during this webinar you feel like maybe you have a place here, maybe you have ideas that you want to exchange, to discuss. Yeah, just please reach out to us and you are most welcome. Okay, Sean, next slide. So here's a list of our past activities, just to say that we've been present in IAIA conferences. We've written fast tips, which you can have access in the materials for this webinar. And Keisha, you can go to the next slide, please. And this is what's coming next. So we'll be in Bologna. If you haven't registered yet for IAIA conference, if you are, undecided, it is a great place to be in contact with this class of professionals. It is a heartwarming place. It is a place where it's easy to feel that you belong to. So don't have second thoughts if you are undecided and just a little bit unsure. Yeah, register. I'm sure that you will not regret about it. Also, there is a pre-course that I will be delivering with Ana Maria Esteves on psychology informed impact assessments. This runs on the 29th and the 30th, and it is a 2-day course. It is hands-on on bringing psychology into the impact assessment practice. It is that we're very excited with this. There are also a few writings in preparation, and if you stay connected, we will surely share that with you in due time. We're looking forward for that. Keisha, we can go to the next slide, please. Right. So, yeah, one of the things that uh, people keep asking us is what is psychosocial impact assessment, and it's even though we feel that we know what we're doing, it's difficult to write it down and put it on paper. Actually, this group, we've been discussing this a lot, and I still feel that we have slightly different views about it, which is great. It's diversity is amazing. So here I just broke down 4 key elements. So the first is theories and methodologies from social sciences. So just to unpack this, social sciences means anthropology, means ethology, ethnography, sociology, psychology, which where I come from. And for instance, within psychology, you can have things like social psychology, health psychology, community psychology, different fields, and within these fields, you have different subfields that can contribute to the practice of psychology, of psychosocial impact assessment. The second key element is it is about measuring the impacts of events, policies, or projects on well-being. And just to unpack here, an event might be, like an environmental disaster, for instance. Policies might be, something. Imagine a change in land usage law, and projects, any type of infrastructure projects, a dam, a mining, a mine, a highway, whatever. Well-being, by well-being, impacts on well-being, we mean 2 different things. So well-being has to do with at the individual level, so it's at the psychological individual level. It might be impacts on people, the level of stress on people, anxiety, might be on people capacity to fulfill their aspirations. But there is also a dimension which has to do with a more social component, which has to do, for instance, anything that has to do with interpersonal or intergroup relationships, like social support, social capital, for instance, just to give you an example. Psychosocial impact assessment is particularly tuned to look at the interplay between these psychological and social variables, dimensions. The fourth element to this is that psychosocial impact assessment has to do with measuring the impacts of events on the individual and communities who may be affected in the future or are being affected in the present currently. And this might also be the case of looking at impacts that are already occurring. So we call this exposed impacts, but also just the perceptions associated to the project. They might also they are crucial and fundamental to understand the impacts of the project. And in psychology, psychosocial impact assessment is particularly well suited to look at this. And the final element is that psychosocial impact assessment has been used both to measure impacts, to predict impacts, so what we call ex ante, or to talk about impacts that are already going on, which is called ex post. And this has been this practice has been applied across multiple geographies and communities. Just to say that psychosocial impact assessment is in terms of a structured procedure to do this. When it's done in the context, for instance, of a project, you usually use a framework that is, for instance, social impact assessment. There is a framework to do a social impact assessment, and you run it within that. Or if you're doing a health impact assessment, you do it within the framework that it's designed to do it. There is no framework to do psychosocial impact assessments ex ante. And if you're doing psychosocial impact assessment ex post, in that specific case, so if you're measuring impacts that are already taking place, then usually that looks a little bit like a social research project. Next slide, Keisha, please. All right, so why does it matter? And very quickly, just to say 3 reasons why we believe that this matters. First, it's scope. A complete understanding of impacts and of the impact assessments process requires the understanding of psychosocial impacts. Those are unique. You can have impacts on land. You can have, for instance, impacts on land usage with a consequence on livelihoods or social economic impacts that are associated. But then there are dimensions that have to do, for instance, with the level of control that the person has regarding that change, or things that have to do with maybe it is the level of the level of identity that threatens the loss of the land, and those things are particularly well addressed under a psychosocial impact assessment lens. The second one is reach, understanding things like amplification or buffer or chain effects. By amplification or buffer, this is really simple. For instance, if you think about a community that is losing land, in that specific case, the impacts might be positive and negative. For instance, if losing land threatens their identity because that's what they know, that's what they believe in, that's what they want to be part of their life, then of course you might have negative impacts associated to that. So, but at the same time, losing land, if for instance, if that is associated with something that you don't like particularly, you don't like agriculture or farming, you've been looking your entire life for a different opportunity in your life, that might be actually an opportunity to convert this loss into a positive impact. So psychosocial impact assessment really provides a great lens to understand these amplification or buffer effects. The final reason why we believe that psychosocial impact assessment matters has to do with integration. We believe that psychosocial impact assessment and psychosocial impacts, they are really important to communicate between different disciplines. For instance, psychosocial impacts, a set of psychosocial impacts are particularly related with health impacts as well. Imagine anything that has to do with mental health, depression, anxiety, stress, coping strategies, just to give a few examples. The same thing with social impacts, I've given a few examples here. But not only that, psychosocial impact assessment is particularly equipped to understand beliefs and perceptions of impacts of the communities. And I've seen a lot of professionals from that have been doing social impact assessment, professionals that have been doing health impact assessment, human rights impact assessment. I've seen a lot of professionals a little bit lost with where do they fit the set of beliefs and perceptions that the communities have about the projects. So we believe deeply that this provides a great way of communicating between the different fields. Keisha, next slide, and I believe this is back to Will.
And I'm back. Next slide, please. So our next presenter is Professor Michael Edelstein, who's kind of the godfather of the field of psychosocial impact assessment. He's forgotten more about the field than I will ever know. He's the author of Contaminated Communities and has studied and worked in this field for decades. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Will, and welcome everybody. My role is to give an actual vignette that's hands-on. And I just want to say before I do that, that when we do psychosocial impact assessment, our concern is with what I call the whole social process continuum, from the individual and family and community all the way up to the society. And those are nested and interactive components. When a consequence happens at one level of the social process, it has ramifications inevitably at others. The impacts that I work with, I refer to as lifescape impacts or impacts to the basic assumptions that people, or it could be organizations, whatever, but that people have in the course of their normal lives. Assumptions about their health, assumptions about how much control they have over their lives, assumptions about how safe their homes are or the environment is, whether they can trust others and institutions, government, to protect them and to support them. I'm also concerned with lifestyle, the normal patterns that people live their lives with, their activities, and how those change when something happens to force the change to occur. And then I'm concerned with life strain, the amount of stress that people normally live with and how they cope with that. And by extension, how that can be changed by what I call environmental turbulence, or some major change to the environment that could occur as an event that's occurred in the past, or the present, or the future. It could also be a project that's proposed that will change the quality of people's lives. In doing this case study, I want to show you hands-on how I do interviews. I am focused primarily in my work on doing individual and family interviews, and then building from that with other materials to impacts at other levels of social process. And so let me just do it. So this is my book, Contaminated Communities. I chose an example from this book. It's an example that involves environmental contamination, but let me just say that the same approach to environmental turbulence can occur for any impact area: climate change, major projects, forced relocation, et cetera, et cetera. And focusing on family disintegration from toxic exposure, I also want to note that I have another case study that follows this that looks at families that pull together in the face of this kind of turbulence. But the example I'm giving is one of disintegration. I'm just going to read it. Lewis, a retired man in his 60s with one college-age child, had been blind since his late teens. Some 25 years prior to our interview, he and his wife purchased a rural home with an adjacent rental property. The financial independence this property afforded allowed them to spend much of their time at home. Despite his blindness, Lewis was independent to an extent that was amazing to a new acquaintance. He moved about freely in and outside of his home. His ability to describe the natural features of the area surpassed that of many sighted people. He actively participated in maintaining his property, doing such chores as splitting wood for the stove. And particularly since his retirement, his life had been centered almost entirely around his home and property. After a chemical factory moved in next door in the early 1970s, Lewis and his wife suffered various direct impacts from its operation. Increasingly preoccupied with the factory, they came to spend the bulk of their free time seeking help from the government. Even when it meant neglecting their child, Lewis would spend hours dictating letters to be sent to various officials who might help them. His wife typed the letters and mailed them. When groundwater contamination was later identified in their well, they felt certain that the factory was the source, and as a result, they increased their efforts to get assistance. Unsuccessful in eliciting help, Lewis's preoccupation with the pollution intensified. He believed that he and his family were exposed to dangerous chemicals that affected their health and threatened genetic damage. He saw himself as fighting for a wrong brought against not only his family, but also the entire community. For Lewis, the key issue was his family's exposure to chemicals and the inevitable consequences. In contrast, over time, his wife began to rethink their obsession with the factory. She felt guilty that her child had been raised during protracted turmoil that prevented a normal home life and caused the boy a mental strain evident in his teenage years. But to Lewis, his son's mental strain resulted, quote, from the physical problems from the water. His nerves are affected from ingesting the water by drinking, eating, and bathing. Over time, Lewis's wife developed new interests. She was reborn through religion, and she also began a career. As his wife and son became increasingly mobile and centered elsewhere, the pollution issue became correspondingly less important for them, even as it became increasingly central to Lewis. Continual misunderstandings resulted from this different emphasis. During their 1983 interview, Lewis's wife and son maintained that the incident was over and that it was time to get past it and to go on with their lives. But to Lewis, quote, you can't walk away from something that is now within your body. Rejecting their attitude as a Band-Aid, Lewis became increasingly bitter at his wife's disinterest in pursuing the case. Of himself, he proclaimed, I don't give up. If you're going to beat me, you're going to have to kill me. As a blind man, Lewis was particularly dependent on his wife to maintain his high level of activity. She acted as his secretary, his collaborator, his chauffeur. But as she refocused her energies, Lewis was increasingly hampered in his ability to fight for restitution and achieve the resulting catharsis. Sitting alone much of the day, he was unable to distract himself through reading or traveling. Instead, he was left to stew in anger. Excuse me. Increasingly, he perseverated on the need to complete actions that he felt were necessary. For example, at the time of the interview, a form sent by their lawyer had sat uncompleted for a whole week. Lewis was obsessed with getting the form finished. He was outraged that his wife had not helped him fill it out immediately. He alienated her with continuous reminders. It became obvious that as the pressures had mounted in the family, Lewis had not only lost his secretarial support, but he also had lost his emotional support. He said, it's hell for me. I'm here all the time. I cannot leave. She refuses to read and write for me. She's out all day. When she comes home, I'm in bed. I eat sandwiches. I'm like a prisoner. I have no nourishing meals. It's not a normal relationship. She eats standing up in a rush all the time. As his wife avoided the issue, she needed to avoid him. As he sat pondering what needed to be done and composing letters that he was unable to send, he felt caught in a true dilemma. To maintain the ongoing battle to protect his family and community, he needed his wife's help. When a response was required, he reminded her. Seeing her but infrequently, the topic dominated their conversation, motivating her to avoid responding. This dynamic is seen in the following exchange from their interview. Wife, Lewis always mentions pollution. I went along with that for a long, long time. Lewis, my only regret is that I don't have more time to devote to this. It's a necessity. Wife, he talks about it all the time. Every time he sees me, he says, we have the letter that has to be sent. Lewis, the percentage of time devoted to this is about 2 minutes a day on average. Wife, do you deny that every time we get company, 2/3 of the conversation is about the factory? Lewis, that's an exaggeration. It's a lie. Wife, I'm tired. We've been sending letters since 1974. Lewis, I'm stronger than you are. I'm a human being too. I regret that I don't have more time to spend on it. It's wrong to let him, the factory owner, get away with it. I only devote 2 minutes a day on average. Lewis was being prevented from dealing with the issue that consumed him, but to mention it was to make it even less likely that the issue would be dealt with. From his wife's perspective, creating a normal home life required that the topic of the pollution be expunged from their interaction. Yet the more she fought to eradicate it from the limited family communication, the more obsessed Lewis became. He even began to lose the powers of concentration that allowed him to organize his thoughts despite his blindness. Once proud of his competence, he became increasingly embarrassed at its loss. He periodically suffered from choking episodes during periods of extreme frustration and anxiety. Although Lewis sought justice, revenge, and relocation, which would further provide confirmation of his perceptions, his wife and son just wanted the crisis to be over. They accomplished this cognitively. It was over because they decided it was over. Their view was that even if the pollution issue never got resolved, it was more important to bring something positive into their lives. This exchange captures their conflict. Lewis: it's a scientifically proven fact that there's chromosome damage. Son: I realize it, but there's nothing there now. Wife: you can't only worry about physical effects, but mental effects also. We could go crazy fighting all the time. Son: physically I was young, so it didn't do much to me. Wife: you can't expect a child to go through this. Lewis: it's not a manufactured thing. You have to try and do something. Son: the situation is gone. Lewis: you can't put a paper bag over your face and say it's not there. Wife: you put holes in the paper bag and you keep going on. Lewis: that's silly. Son: that's not silly. Their coping strategies were totally divergent. Although neither Lewis's fixation nor his wife's and son's defensive avoidance was particularly adaptive. The wife and the son sought to make up for the years lost due to the incident. Lewis couldn't get past it. The wife, feeling guilty for subjecting her son to so distorted a home life, was just as fixated on eradicating the issue from their lives, no matter its merit, as Lewis was in keeping it as the central issue. This difference formed a barrier between them. Lewis claimed he no longer trusted his wife. He wanted her to leave. She wanted to stay until her son was older. Both blamed the pollution incident for destroying their relationship. Were there causes for the schism in this family besides contamination? Lewis's wife might have developed other interests, sought increased independence from her husband in any case. At the very least, the pollution issue contributed strongly to family conflict, driving Lewis's wife to other interests as much to avoid the pollution situation as to find new interests and independence. Her changed role was more than liberation from being a homemaker or rebellion against the dependency of another. It had the added significance of ending their years of shared collaborative activity against the polluter that had become their dominant context for their relationship. It's neither surprising that she evaded her husband, nor that Lewis interpreted her evasion as a break of trust. This case illustrates how a family can be split by the stress of pollution incident, or another significant turbulence. For Lewis to persist in seeking answers to the fundamental question of health and justice was quite reasonable. And yet, because our society is so ill-prepared to tackle these questions, he was stalemated in pursuing them. His task was Sisyphean. What happened at first to be a competent and direct approach to the family's needs thus became an unproductive and dysfunctional element in the family's life. In contrast, his wife and son chose to reorient their lives to more constructive purposes. A healthy decision for their mental health, although it avoided dealing with persistent issues of their experience. In a sense, therefore, neither choice is ideal. In fact, people in this family's situation lack an optimal option. So that gives you a quick feel for what happens at the family level when you have this kind of environmental turbulence. Let me turn this over to Will to get our panel discussions comments.
Great, thank you, Mike. Great example. Now we have two panel discussants, Emeritus Professor Helen Ross, a highly experienced researcher who described psychosocial impacts among Australian Aboriginal people decades ago and has a special interest in community resilience. And we have Ruari Carthew, a consultant based in Sweden, who has familiarity with psychosocial issues facing First Nations peoples in Canada and in Northern Europe. So Ruari and Helen, if you can put your cameras and your microphones on, that would be great.
Thanks, Will.
Thank you.
Okay. She'll lead off. Mike, thank you for a very rich, intense individual example there of what's going on between three members of a family in whom there's a certain interdependence with Louis' disability. When focusing on how you do psychosocial impact assessment, when you're doing a study such as that, so that's clearly based on interview, I'll ask first, how do you build the relationship when you're going into a community? I mean, I do know a lot of the history of your studies and the extent to which you've been invited, but we need not assume that a community is a cohesive place where everybody knows everybody. They may well be land neighbours and not know everybody, but how do you get started when you're going in there? And how do you build the relationships that build that level of trust that has people revealing to you in the degree they did in, I suspect that might have been more than one interview you're reporting there?
Well, I've had the fortune or misfortune, as it may be, but to work for a lot of lawyers doing lawsuits, at which point people are plaintiffs or they have brought those lawsuits, or working for communities that are opposing a project that they think is hazardous or disruptive of their community and dangerous to themselves. And in those cases, I get invited in. So I have not tended to go in cold to communities. I have done it occasionally, at which point you need to find a social network and somebody who will give you entry to it. But when you're going through an administrative proceedings or opposition to a project where people have grouped together and organized, that organization or the legal process provides a mode of entry. And the people who've committed themselves to opposing a project or to seeking some kind of outcome from a court or administrative proceedings, they've made a commitment to share. They have given up their privacy in order to advance their cause, and therefore they're willing to be open and generally very accessible.
Thanks.
Ruari, have you got a question?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much, Michael. I do have a question, and this ties a little bit into one of the comments that Sergio had in his presentation, and specifically towards the interpersonal relationships and then intergroup relationships. So it's a really good example where you have you can see how the effect of the project has really impaired the family dynamic and resulted in great sort of upset to that family. I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to what happens when you see the same incident or type of impacts being played out in multiple families in a small population, and how that plays into the psychosocial impacts at different scales.
So another excellent question. Well, what you're really attempting to do in any given interview is, of course, be there 100% in the present and to respond in a way that really builds a rapport with the people that you're interviewing and respects what they have to say, and you listen and record and really take in what they say. But of course, that begs the question that you're raising, which is the reaction of this family only this family, or is it something that in fact, is characteristic of other responses in this community or other responses of people affected by whatever the event or project is that you're studying. And there you need to do other interviews, and you need to be totally in the present, you need to listen. And it's only after you've really done enough interviews to what I call saturation, where you know enough and you know that you can stop. And you also look at other information that may be available, be it in the media or in testimony that people have given at hearings or in other kinds of documents, that you can actually look and see whether or not you have confirmation that this kind of intense response is in fact characteristic of the particular event you're studying. And of course, as a social scientist, I'm concerned across events and across situations, across communities. Do you see the same kind of events occurring? And the reason why I have been able to develop the kind of theoretical models I have is because I have, in fact, seen enough across enough communities. I can also compare that with what other people have seen. And you begin to really see that the kind of event I just read is not necessarily a rare event. This is not a one-off. This is something that, in fact, families do experience in some way in this kind of environmental turbulence that I'm talking about.
There's one question. We have time for one more question. There's a question that's been highlighted in the Q&A stream about, in looking at a family, how do you integrate considerations of gender dynamics? I guess in this instance, would the wife have gotten fed up with her husband at this point in her life anyway? To what extent does that exacerbate, or to what extent can these dynamics mitigate some of the effects?
Well, I mentioned that very point. One can't rule out the fact that a wife in a situation where she was attending so carefully to a person who was dependent on her might very well have felt a need for dependence, and even someone in a relationship who didn't have that dependency could feel that. So those gender dynamics are certainly there, and one can't rule out that a split might have occurred, a rift might have occurred absent this situation. But it was very clear. I read 10 minutes from a 5-hour interview, and it was just very clear that this was a dominant aspect of their relationship, and it played a key role in splitting them up. Certainly, it might have happened anyway. There might have been a lot of other contributing factors. One can't rule that out. But when impacts occur, they never occur in a vacuum anyway. They always intensify things that were already happening. They may cause things that weren't happening before, but the extent to which they move has a lot to do with what's already in place. So, and histories that have existed. So, the question is right on. You certainly need to pay attention to gender dynamics, but you need to understand the relationship between those and the turbulence that you're studying.
Okay, great. Thanks. So what we're hearing is a family, pre-existing family dynamics, this overlay of what's going on in the community, selecting an example of this one family to suggest things that are happening in other parts of the community as well. Very compelling example. We'll now move on to another example. So if we can move to the next slide and get Sergio on camera. And the next slide after that. Okay, over to you, Sergio.
Hey, great. Yeah, nice to hear Mike's story. So bringing here something that is slightly different, because this is a mining project that it's a story about a mining project in the permitting phase. It's a project that I've worked on. It's anonymized for for the reasons that you are all well aware of. And the reason why I say this is different is that because this story happens within a social impact assessment project. So this is a mining project. It takes about 2,000 acres of communal and private lands. It happens in a rural, age, low income community. And when I started this project, I could see in the news that there was this community opposition against the project. It was not generalized, but there was instances of opposition with public manifestations against the project, for instance, organized public manifestations against the project. There was this concern about the impact on cultural heritage. People have this way of living in these communal lands that's related with, farming, with, cattle grazing, and all of these products from the land with extremely high quality. It's like they have some products that have this world-class quality. So they were really concerned with, and it's not just a matter of livelihood. It is also a matter of them identifying themselves with this pride around these products. And there is also something that I got aware of when I started to this project is this generalized mistrust. And so just to say that the project happens and it's like in a mountain place, it has huge visual impact. There is no way around it. There is a huge visual impact. And so in terms of the additional impacts of the project, noise, dusts, and in terms of traffic, the access road doesn't cross the villages, so there is an impact, maybe not directly to these communities. The communities we're talking about something between 400 and 800 families. So it's kind of a small villages that are in the unicity of the project. Some households are close to the concession area of the project, so there are some households that will feel the impacts of the activity quite strongly. Also, in terms of the positive impacts, the other side of this is, it's a rural age, low income community. And when I started to engage with these communities, they talk about dead villages. And dead villages are villages that they stopped to have people living there. So there's like a final person that was living there, they died, and then there is no one else living there. And it is a village, it's not a household, it is like a village. There were many families living there. So it is a rural place, these are rural places, they are isolated, and they are away from the mainstream capitals and cities. So there's this hope that a project like this can actually improve the socio-economic dynamic. I'm telling you this, if you have experience with running, psychosocial impact assessment, social impact assessment, health impact assessment, if you have any experience working with these type of projects, you've heard this. It's just the configuration of this project in particularly is special, but you've heard this before. I'm absolutely sure of that. Something else that I wanted to have is, so I've worked with these communities for a long period, and one of the things that came as that came afloat is this generalized mistrust, and this is particularly important. So this mistrust has to do with they were not only mistrusting I don't know why there are so many hearts here. Doesn't matter. So this mistrust is against the project proponents, but also against some community members and some community groups. So this was out there, and I just want to tell I've trust is a concept that I value it so much. I think it's so important for us to understand the meaning of trust. It's like it's something that connects us all. And I just wanted to take the opportunity to talk about, the level of mistrust in this project. So when I talk about mistrust, like in the literature, they call the 3 Ds of mistrust. So the first one is that you've kind of you disengage. So you become defensive. The first one is defensiveness. You become defensive. Like people tell you things about the project or whatever, and just kind of, I'm not sure if this is like this person is telling me. So it's like a lot of question marks in your head. The second level is disengagement. It's just you don't want to listen to what people are saying about the project. Just you don't want to be in those conversations. Just turn your back away. And the final one is disenchantment. Disenchantment is actually going back with fire. It's going back with a fight. So this is what was happening with the communities. Disenchantment has to do with whatever they say about the project. You have something against that um, to reiterate, to respond. So there's like this positive impacts. Oh, these positive impacts, they are not for everyone. We will not leave those positive impacts. For instance, you go right back and you attack back the project or anyone that is defending the project. So it's like these three levels: defensiveness, disengagement, and the disenchantment. Well, here are a few quotes. Keisha, you can go next slide and just note here a few quotes on from communities about the project. Some community members, again, you've listened to this. This was translated, and keeps like the rawness in the way people talk. So in one of the quotes, this community member was telling me, it should have been opening. It should have been open now already. It should have been open many years ago. If this was open many years ago, communities wouldn't be as they are. There was this. I've listened to this one a lot. The second one, this is just an iteration, which is people getting to me and saying, you are the first one coming here. Thank you very much. This third one, actually, this is very special. This was a particularly sad moment. I've heard this in many variations again, but people getting and saying, there is no horizon for us. We stopped having an horizon overnight. Can you imagine the pain? This was like, there was deep suffering here. And then the thing to do with the installed conflict between the communities as well. There is a certain antagonism. Certain people in the community don't even talk to each other anymore. Well, Will, back to you. Actually, I think it's back to Helen and Rory, and yeah, looking forward to your questions.
Okay, Helen and Rory, if you can get back online and pepper Sergio with challenging questions.
Okay, my camera's on first, so I'll go first, Sergio. Look, another very, very deep picture of complex reactions, and you've portrayed, quite a portrait of that community. I'm torn between. Yeah, I'll come to your methods in a moment, but to get a deep picture like that, and in a context, a particular sort of context, how do you go about that? They've said you're the first to come to talk to them. I know you're a believer in big mixed methods. How do you get to the richness and the complexity of what's going on? For instance, I can read between the lines and tell me if I'm completely wrong. Values are strongly in there, and you've mentioned the cultural ones as well. And I compare in my head with communities where some want to attract back youth, make employment for youth at all costs, attract a population back, as against the ones who, like things rather more like they already are. So, but yes, let's come back to my first issue and question. How do you go about understanding, developing, and then voicing this rich picture of what's going on?
Yeah, Ellen, we this, you've done this. So we talk about instrumental engagement, which is just you go to the communities and you want to get what you want to get, or you want to inform the communities about what you want to inform, and just kind of a tit for tat. And we talk about meaningful engagement, or the way I experience it, at least it is transformational engagement, which requires for you to stay in presence and permanence, to give time to understand, learn from the communities, to listen, be curious, be attentive. So, in meaningful engagement, we talk about it's not. It's not just the outcome; it's the process that it's important. It's not regulatory. It doesn't have to do with ticking the boxes. It is oriented towards solution, and it's not focused or just focused on solving problems. It's actually focused on empowering people. So I engage the communities with this in my mind. It's a little bit intuitive, to be honest.
Thank you.
Yep. Rory?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Sergio. I really appreciate the way that you described the situation. And it's certainly one of the ways in which PSIA appeals to me is that it provides a context for allowing the complexity of humans and of humanity and communities. And in your example, and I think you're quite right that a lot of these examples are almost ubiquitous in the field of impact assessment, and you're often dealing with lots of dualities where you have lots of traumas that are experienced by some groups and not by others. You have haves and have-nots, and you have often rifts that are developed in communities. And so I'm curious if you might offer some comment on both how to navigate those divides, as well as for some of the listeners and participants, an idea of how long you yourself might spend in a community if you had an ideal timeline. Um,
Yeah, maybe let's start there. Thank you, Rory, for the question. Let's start with the last question, which how long you stay with the communities, and the way I see the engagement process under a social impact assessment or psychosocial impact assessment is this is not uh, uh, fly in, fly out type of thing. And it's not a matter of fly in, stay enough time, and then fly out. When you're doing this, you are opening the doors for continuated exchange with the communities over the lifespan of the project and beyond. So what basically the way I see this is you are kind of emulating for a client the engagement process, and then you will empower the communities and the client so that they can take their hands on, that they can reclaim and hone the engagement process. So this is in terms of time, it should durate the time of the project. Our approach. So if you want to characterize, represent the community, it really depends on the characteristics of the project, of the community, of the conflict, of if there is conflict installed. It depends on it is very nuanced. And what I would say is, if you're thinking about running in a complex project, running a survey that takes like 2 weeks to prepare, maybe 2 or 3 weeks to deliver and to collect the data, and then another 2 or 3 weeks to do data analysis, this will do very little for the project. It might allow you to create a general representation of the perceptions of the communities if the survey is a good one, but it will do very little for this deep granular understanding that is needed to make decisions about the project, to engage the communities in the decisions that matter for them, that will have a lasting impact on them. So yeah, and the way to navigate this, these dualities is just acknowledging that they are there. Just a matter of not kind of trying to please anyone. It's just a matter of not trying to, to be in a place of instrumentalities, acknowledging that there is this complexity, that there is this different set of views, that people have different representations, and that the decision process will thrive with this, and it will die if you shy away from complexity. So it's just staying enduring in this complexity.
Helen, have you got another question?
Yes, Sergio, you mentioned they're a client, and I'm very glad you did, because I think quite a frequent scenario in impact assessment is the only reason what of any type, the only reason one is being done is because there is a developer or some other client who, you know, wants or needs an assessment made, and if you're very lucky, they'll pick somebody who's actually aware of the psychosocial dimensions and open and will ask the right questions to look for them. More rarely, and I've been fortunate here, actually, and Mike has a lot, the community will ask you, and the community is your client. And in other scenarios, I've noticed many of my colleagues, we can actually negotiate it and say, well, look, somebody's paying us to come in and do this, but sorry, I want to make the community the equal client here, and these are my terms for doing the job. How do you find that plays out, or do you have particular solution approaches where you could well be perceived as, hello, this developer's sending in this bloke to, and yet you want and you clearly do develop a very empathetic picture without taking sides. And yet you've got to come back and your report needs to be trusted as well, not just thrown in the bin. So how do you navigate that? What's your
Yeah,
personal way of navigating that three-way relationship?
yeah, an incredibly important question, which is that of integrity, that of ethics. And clients will push you in all sorts of different ways. And I believe that sometimes there is this simplified representation that it's evil, it's the capitalism in the projects. And sometimes it isn't. It's just that some clients they don't know better, or some members of teams they don't know better. Just they will pull you in a set of different ways. And for me, the critical element is I deeply believe within me that the closer we are to the truth of the experience of impacts of a community, the closer we are to making decisions in a way that is sustainable. And this is what I say to clients is don't shy away from conflict. Don't shy away from because conflict is an opportunity for better decisions. That's what the research on organizational psychology shows is that the better teams, the better outcomes come from teams that are open to conflict. For instance, just to give you an empirical example. Well, but going back to our conversation, what I was saying is I deeply believe in this, and all of my practice is guided to getting closer to the truth, getting closer and closer to the truth of the representation, of the perception, of the experience of those communities. Um, yeah, and of course, Ellen, I've been in projects where I get to the communities and they say, "So, who are you?" "Yeah, I'm Sergio. And who are you working for?" "I'm working for X or Y." "Oh, you're being paid by them." We don't. Oh, here comes another one. And what you need to do is, okay, this story is closed. You go to the next one, and then you go to the next one, and then suddenly you start talking with people, and then people will start talking about you to other people. And then when you knock at those doors at the second or the third time, like, okay, this time I will speak to you just because. And then there's an opportunity for us to learn and to exchange. Yeah.
That's
Okay,
familiar.
right. Okay, so it's a great example, a good discussion, and it sounds the case you presented sounds so much like projects that we've all been involved in. A big project, community members feeling disruption, threat to things they cherish, distrustful. You need to go to the community and listen, find a way to give them a voice, assess what's happening to individuals and among individuals, and then that experience being pushed by a client. So if we can get Mike, move to the next slide, please. And if we can get Mike online, we actually have 5 minutes for Q&A. And I've been looking at the list there, and one that comes to mind that I'll address to all of you is, how do you establish a psychosocial baseline? That is, how were things before the project? And either at a, because we all know it's not a moment before the project, there's a history there as well. And does even the concept of a baseline make sense?
Well, if I can speak to that, establishing a baseline is the key to all of the work. If you're doing a proposed project and you're looking at the impacts of that, potential impacts of that project, obviously the proposal establishes some degree of baseline. It's the point at which life as it existed before, or conditions as they existed before, are subject to the potential of change. And of course, after the facility opens, the actuality of whatever happens. In situations in which there isn't a clear project proposal, or there's not some impact assessment being done, but an event has occurred, or there's a response, a turbulence from a project that has existed in the past, you have to go back and look for where the baseline is. And it may in fact be a sliding baseline. People become aware of things oftentimes incrementally. And at some point, something happens that confirms and makes concrete the fact that some change has occurred, and people come to really believe it. And that tends to be, you need to identify that. And all of the impacts tend to follow, or most of them follow, from establishing that baseline, but there may be multiple baselines.
Who else wants to comment on that?
I was going to echo that with a slightly different view, Will and Mike. I guess with an illustration, I agree with what Mike's saying. I'm also cautious about the association with, before, after experimental testing like causality. I know we don't work like that, but the idea of baseline often comes from that logic. As I've said in some previous conferences, I just had an inspirational project many years ago with an Aboriginal community in Australia talking about a mine, and they said, in effect, hang on here, we don't start here. And they took me right back in oral history interviews, which they decided that method. They didn't know the term, but they said, we're going to talk about it this way, stories. And they took it back a century to the very first white invasion, settlement, colonization. And between them, they explained phase after phase after phase of impact and adjustment in quite distinct waves. And therefore, now, pre-mine, or in that deep angst of the mine proposed and seeming it was unstoppable, that was not their baseline. A couple of years ago was not their baseline. Their baseline was everything that had happened over a century, and they absolutely wanted me and our readers, because I was working with an Aboriginal lady, Jumina, to understand the real baseline was that successive history.
Roy?
And their survivals. So
that's why I always try and focus on what I call eco-historical context, because you have, historical trauma, you have all kinds of things that are a baseline for what a current event is judged by and understood by. So you're right on.
But Rory, what were you going to add?
Yeah, well, much of what I was going to say has just been said. So, but this speaks to one of the comments that was in the online question related to intergenerational trauma, and in the Canadian context, this speaks heavily towards the eco-history of Indigenous peoples in Canada, and similar to, Helen, what you were describing with Aboriginal peoples in Australia. And in the impact assessment process, I'm most familiar with the Canadian one. The challenge there is that you in order to make accurate predictions of how people are now and how they stand to be affected by a project, you have to have a baseline to work off of. And when we're dealing with issues of intergenerational trauma, we often, or I have often used sort of terms to sort of say you're starting from a heavily damaged baseline or a heavily fractured baseline. And it's very important that the affected communities are able to give voice to, you know, how damaged that existing baseline is today. And if you look at the sort of significance threshold in impact assessment, if that heavily damaged baseline is already at a point where, you know, this community or this group of people are so besieged by trauma and historical injustices that any additional stuff will just make things worse, then you're basically starting at a existing baseline position that's past the point of significance. And so it then becomes an issue of sort of articulating that and outlining that, you know, so you can present that as evidence.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and we'll throw this to Sergio for a response. And I'm combining two from the Q&A forum. How do you mitigate impacts, enhance community resilience, and handle expectations that you can or somebody will mitigate the impacts?
Yeah. You know, I always feel that this is twofold. So the first thing is you can rely on literature to understand how to, stress process, for instance, and how you can, the variables that will influence stress, that can increase and decrease stress, imagine. So give you an example, social support is a great way for people to cope and to reduce their stress levels, just to give an example. At the same time, so this is twofold. So you look at theories in the literature that allow you to account for, understand the psychosocial impacts that are in place of a project. Very specific, context dependent to the communities, to the type of project, to the type of proponents, to the type of conversation that's been going on in the communities. The other element of this, which is absolutely crucial, is communities need to make sense of the impacts. They need to have time to create a narrative, make sense of the impacts, and themselves they need to come up with their own tools, their own suggestions, their own ideas about how they want to deal with those impacts, how they want to address the impacts that are meaningful for them. And I believe that the difficult thing is to have a dialogue between, things that are common sense, opinion of the communities of people, and what science says that it's better. But this is fundamental to get the engagement parts, and it is absolutely fundamental. Yeah.
One more quick comment from one of you.
Can't add to that. Good answer. Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, well, I'll summarize now. If we could move to the next slide. Great, thanks. So what's happened today is we've outlined the range of situations that you say you're addressing, you and the audience. We've described impacts that probably resemble the things that you're seeing. We've identified ways to build trust, to capture these stories, to help people to make sense and to give voice to the experiences they've had. And we've underlined the importance of having a long time frame in identifying the before or the baseline or the trend line. What we're eager to get, either if you can type it into the Q&A right now or in response to the survey that comes out after the webinar has ended, if you could describe what psychosocial impact assessment means in 1 to 2 sentences with a target audience in mind. How would you describe it to a colleague or to a client or to members of a community or to someone in government? So I'll hand it back to Keisha, who will then close up this webinar, and we'll look forward to hearing your descriptions of psychosocial impact assessment.
Great, thank you. My camera is just taking a moment to load. Here we go. Perfect. Thank you, Will, and thank you to everybody. I will just leave that slide up for a moment just so you have that prompt there. Again, if you would like to put that answer, the describe PSIA in 1 to 2 sentences, into the questions tab, you can do that. But if in case you don't have time before I end the webinar today, I have also put that as a question in the final follow-up survey. So on that note, thank you again all for joining us. There were over 1,000 of you registered here today from over 100 different countries. We had about 300 of you on live. So again, thank you so much for joining. We know we did not have time to answer all of your great questions, but we will do our best to kind of look through them and see if there might be enough to even do a third installment of this webinar, or potentially follow up with some of you on your questions as well. So again, as you leave here today, you're going to be asked to fill out a survey. Please do fill this out. It really helps us not only plan future webinars on topics that you might suggest, but also just how to improve for next time. I do want to address, I know that during the beginning of the webinar, part of our chat as organizers was going through to all of you. So thank you for your patience with that. Again, if you joined us for a webinar in the past, you saw that this is a new updated interface, and we're still kind of figuring out the different little things with it, the settings and whatnot. So thank you for your patience with that. So now I'll flip to this next slide, just to again mention that we have our handle there that you can tag us in at IAIA Network, as well as a hashtag IAIA webinar to use if you'd like to share anything from today's webinar. If you are a member of IAIA, please feel free to start a conversation in the hub with our IAIA members. That would be a great place to continue this conversation. Again, there were lots of questions that didn't get answered, but we do have a platform there. Otherwise, even on LinkedIn, it would be great to start a conversation about some of these questions. So again, thank you all for joining. Please do fill out that survey. We really appreciate it, and it helps us. And I hope to see you all at IAIA 25 in Bologna, Italy in just a couple of months. So thank you. Until next time, have a good day.